This video is the first in a series on the style of bookbinding called Coptic. Coptic bookbinding is generally characterized by an exposed spine with visible stitching. It's one of the oldest bookbinding styles, but it's also commonly used modernly because of the artistic flexibility that it offers. Unlike other bookbinding styles, Coptic bookbinding can easily be used to make unusually shaped books. Here's a couple of examples that I made. As you can see, it does not require a strictly rectangular book with an even spine. You can use it to make all kinds of sorts of books. I recommend starting with a basic rectangular book, like this one, because it's much easier. Once you have learned the technique, then you can try experimenting with other shapes. There are many different methods for how to sew a Coptic style book. I'm going to demonstrate one of them. This video focuses on preparing the covers and the pages for sewing. Future videos will cover some of the different styles of sewing the book together. So let's get started. First off, you're going to need your paper. For this book, you're going to fold your paper into gatherings or signatures or quires, whatever you want to call them. It's groups of pages that will be sewn together through the spine. I like to do 3 to 5 pages per gathering, depending on the thickness of the paper. Thicker paper, I will do 3. Thin paper, I'll do 5, but most commonly, I will do 4 pages. So, gather your 4 pages together, fold them in half. Again, 4 pages for me. Gather them together, line up the corners, fold them in half. And then I like to use my bone folder to crease the fold, make it nice and flat. And you will do all of your pages the same way. I like to sew my books with 8 to 10 gatherings, depending on what thickness of book I desire. I find much more than that, and the book becomes a little unwieldingly thick. In addition to your pages, you will also need cover boards. I like to make these boards 1/8 of an inch bigger, roughly, on all sides than my folded pages. So, as you can see, it's 1/8 of an inch, roughly bigger on all sides. I make mine out of binder's board or chip board. You can use a reasonably thin cardboard if you prefer. Just something with a little bit of stiffness and not a significant amount of thickness. There are methods of Coptic bookbinding that use wood and other thicker materials that do things a little differently. So, set your pages aside for now. We're going to focus on preparing the covers. So because the covers are not particularly pretty, we want to cover them with a paper, or you can use a fabric. If you use a fabric, I recommend you back it with a Japanese style paper. But I'm going to use scrapbooking paper. I find it works well. So, flip it over to the back. Now, because my paper has an all-over design that I'm not trying to center on anything in particular, I don't have to worry about where my covers are going to go relative, so I'm just going to start in a nice corner to make my life easier. So when we cover the boards, we're going to need to have enough paper to be able to overlap and glue it down on the inside. I find that approximately 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch works well for this. So I'm going to do 1/2 inch. So I'm going to draw my 1/2 inch margin. Both sides of the corner. And then I'm going to place one of my covers on the intersections of the 2 lines and trace around it. And then add the margins to that. Now if I knew the exact size of the covers, which I know the nominal size of the covers, I could simply measure the nominal size of the cover and then add the margins. However, I know that I don't always get them cut out perfectly, so I find that this works better to make sure that my covers will fit, my cover paper will fit the actual covers that I have made. And then I'm going to do the other one right next to it. If you had some design motif that you were trying to center, you would do things a little bit differently. You would find the design motif you wanted to center your book over it, trace around, and then add the margins, as opposed to this method. But I prefer to use papers with an all-over design, so I don't have to worry about that. Once you have traced out both of your cover papers, you're going to cut them out. The books themselves have an outer cover that wraps around, and then an inside end sheet that hides the inside of the ugly chipboard cover. So we're going to cut that out next. I generally prefer to cut it a little bit smaller than the cover so that you can see the cover paper that folds to the inside. I think that's pretty. So nominally, this end sheet should be the same size as your folded gatherings. In my case, for this book, I cut my cover boards just a little bit tall, so I'm going to cut my end sheets a little bit taller than I normally would, so that they will fit nicely. So my folded gatherings are 4 1/4 inches wide. And 5 1/2 inches tall, but as I mentioned, I cut my cover boards just a little bit tall, so I'm going to cut my end sheets just a little bit taller than I would otherwise. So I'm going to go with 5 5/8. Going to check. That looks like it should be a good height. And then I need 2 of them. I'm going to cut these out as well. So now I have my cover paper, cover board, and end sheets for both front and back covers. I have a choice to make. At some point, I am going to have to punch holes into the cover in order to sew through. I can do that now, before I glue the cover pages on, or I can do it after I've glued everything together. The benefits of doing it now is if I screw up, I can repunch the holes in a different place, or simply swap out for a new piece of cover board, and no one will ever know, because any mistakes I make will be covered up with the paper. The downside is that I have to repunch the holes a couple of times as I glue the paper over them. So I'm going to demonstrate both ways. First, we'll start with punching the paper ahead of time. For this, you'll need your board, an awl, a template showing you where to punch, and something to protect your work surface while you do the punching. I use a stack of junk mail. Now, I made this template to make sure that I punch all of the holes in the same place on the cover boards and the pages. So, this template is the same height as the book and has marks an equal distance in from each end, showing where the paper should be, so that when I punch the paper it will be centered. And then I have 4 marks showing where I will punch the holes. I like to punch my holes approximately 1/8 of an inch in from the spine. I find that works well. So what I'm going to do first is draw a line, don't mind the cat, 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. And then I'm going to line up my template along that line and punch at the locations that I marked. Like so. So, now I have the holes punched, now I can start gluing. For this style of book, I like to use just a basic glue stick because it dries fast and I don't have to wait multiple times for the cover to dry before I can continue working. If you prefer to do a more historically accurate version, you would use some form of normal glue, and you would have to wait after each gluing step. So I'm just covering the entire cover board with glue. The other thing you have to decide is which cover is going to be your front, which is going to be your back. I think this will be my front cover. So I need the holes on this side, which is now this side. So I'm going to line up my holes on this side, and then I'm going to line up my cover board inside the lines that I drew around it earlier, and press down and gently smooth it out. Now you want to make sure that you use sufficient glue here that the two will glue together nicely, but you don't need to thoroughly saturate it. Like so. And then normally I would set this aside underneath a heavy book or something while I did the other one, but we're doing all on one cover first. So once the glue has dried just a little bit, I'm going to fold all of the edges in around the board. Now the reason that I picked a 1/2 inch margin is a combination of the thinness of my paper and the thinness of my board. I just want to make sure that there is enough that reaches over to make it easy to glue down, but not so much that it's sticking way out, because you will be able to see a slight indent on the inside where your cover paper folds over. If I were using a thicker board and or a thicker cover material, I would probably want a wider margin than what I used. Now we have this excess paper here at the corners that we want to get rid of. And a nice way to figure out where we need to trim it is to fold over 2 sides, pinch the corner together, and then fold it back and forth a couple of times, creasing it down to form a nice crease where we need to cut. So I'm going to do that on all 4 corners, and then I'm going to cut them out. So I've folded all of my corners and creased them so I know where to cut. So I'm going to cut the extra triangle off of each of my corners. And I like to fold it in to check that I've done it correctly. Some of the common ways that this doesn't work very well is if you don't cut enough, you end up with this paper that's sticking up. That's not what you want. So you got to go in and trim a little bit off, just a little at a time, until it folds nicely. So that's better. Another common mistake is to cut a little bit too much off, and you end up with a little gap where you can see the cover board. Now, depending on the location of that gap, it's either fine or there's a remedy. Now, because this gap is mostly down here, it will probably be covered by the end pages. However, there's a little bit of a gap up here, and we can fix that. So the way to fix that is to take one of the little corners you cut off, and we're going to glue it down in there before we glue the flaps down. However, before we get to that, there's a very important step. We have punched the holes here, but they're not on the front, and once we glue the flap over, we won't be able to see them anymore. So what we need to do is we need to punch them again. Now you can set this against your backstop and punch it that way. What I like to do is just cup my fingers around where the hole is going to be and just punch through with the awl. If you do this, please make sure that you don't accidentally punch your fingers. And you don't need to punch very far through, you just need to mark the location of the hole. It's very important. Okay, so now we can glue our flaps down. First, we're going to glue the extra little piece of paper here to cover the little goof in the corner. And you don't have to do that, it's optional. I just think it looks a little better. So we're going to apply a little bit of glue there, and then we're going to glue the scrap bit down, lining up the edges and the corner. And then we're going to give that a moment to dry while we work on the other flaps. So we're just going to apply some glue, fold the flap over, press it down for a moment to set the glue, and then move on to the next. Now if you're using a glue that isn't a fast drying glue stick, you may have to hold it down for longer, or in some cases I found I fold it over, it pops back up, I do all of them, and then I kind of fold them over and hold them down while I quickly put a weight over top to hold it down while it dries. After having done that a couple of times, I decided that a glue stick works better. or at least is a much easier and more convenient. Alright, once we have all the flaps glued down, we need to glue our end sheet down. Now for me, my end sheet is just sort of an all-over design that doesn't have a clear and definite top and bottom. However, if that was not the case, what I sometimes do to help keep track is I will draw a little arrow on the board indicating which way's up. I can also, if I want to, write whether this is the front cover or the back cover. I really only do that if I have some centralized design that I am that I want for like the front cover versus the back cover. For this one, it doesn't matter. So my options are I can apply glue to the entire back of the end sheet, or I can apply glue to the cover board over the area that the end sheet is going to cover. For a thin paper end sheet like this, I find it's easier to apply the glue to the stiffer cover board. Also, doing it this way, I'm less likely to get glue on my work surface. Although I do get it on my hands. Then I'm going to line the end sheet up where I think I want it. Make sure it's more or less centered. And press down. And then I'm going to take my awl and I'm going to poke back through those holes that I punched to show myself where the holes go. This time I'm going to make sure that the holes are big enough that I can easily pass my needle through. Like so. Now, if I hadn't done that, if I had chosen to wait until I had finished my cover, there's two ways to do this. If you already have a cover that has holes punched where you want them, you'd simply line the covers up. I usually do it cover to cover, and then punch through the holes you already have onto the other cover to mark where they go. Or, since we have a template, we will use the template and I'm going to line up the template 1/8 of an inch, but this time I'm not going to draw a line because I don't want the line to show. However, if I have glued my end sheet correctly, the edge of the end sheet should be approximately 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. And I'm just going to mark the holes very lightly with my awl and then move them to my backstop and punch them fully. One thing you do want to make sure of when you're punching your holes is that you punch them on the correct side so that when you're making your book and stacking it up is the correct direction for both. So now that we've finished the covers, we're going to set them aside and work on the pages themselves. The same template that we used before will be used again, and we're also going to need some form of punching cradle. For this, I have a punching cradle made of wood that I commonly use. However, it doesn't fit on my camera, so I'm going to use an old phone book. instead. Works well. You're going to place each gathering into the center fold, line up your template. Remember, you're lining it up with the inner marks. Take your awl and punch a hole where each of your marks are. And do the same with all of the gatherings. Once you have all of your gatherings punched and your covers prepared, it's time to sew the book together. There are different stitching techniques that you can use, and some of them will be covered in future videos.